Hello, everybody. Ben is muted, but he is talking.
Sorry, I was saying apologies for the difficulties with the Zoom, and thank you to Aaron for getting this started.
Yeah, so I normally I love Zoom. I don't know what's happening. Like, I swear I have this meeting set up so everybody's supposed to be able to join, even though the host isn't here. Whatever. So since we're recording, I'll just say this is a publicly recorded meeting that will be posted to YouTube later. And please adhere to the code of conduct. And I'm going to hand over to Ben Yeller to tell you what this is and why you're here.
Hi, so welcome to the second KIND sub-project meeting. I know things are still pretty ad hoc. We only just managed to have the first one last week. I'm hoping people have some topics, even though they're not actually in the agenda doc yet, just because we had some problems getting that out to everyone.
Could you paste the link to the agenda doc in the channel or in the chat?
I was just grabbing that link.
Okay.
Oops, that's not going to be quite the right one, but whatever. Let me drop some of the metadata. That's a cleaner link. Okay, I see we have one from Pablo with the extended provisioning use cases.
Yes, this is me. That's the topic we were discussing the other day over the Slack channel, and you suggested that I created a document with the description with the use case as a separate document. I started doing that. It's still early draft. I just basically wanted to know that it was the kind of document you were expecting, and if so, should I open an issue and link the issue in the GitHub to the document, or how to drive the conversation around this document? That's basically my question.
I think the thing we're really missing is like what we're trying to like test or cover with this. We know that we can make KIND sort of provision a machine, but there's some problems around like the config needs to be aware of things with KIND. So if we're not fully provisioning Kubernetes, like the cluster API, for example, how is it actually going to be able to build on this in an effective way? And what are we going to, what's actually going to be tested with it? Like, is Kubernetes getting tested? Is and what coverage are we getting there?
Okay, I made some introduction in the document. I can elaborate on that, but basically the specific use case I'm having and then describing in the sequence is that around the cluster API, I'm developing some operators which are complex. I mean, they are not trivial. And there are a lot of that logic which is independent of the actual provider you are using. I don't want to test the providers. I want to test the controllers that manage this life cycle of the cluster and the life cycle of the machines. Mm-hmm. Basically, what I'm testing is that, I mean, what I want to test is to deploy the controller or interact. I mean, actually, deploy the controller is something that I don't know if it will be possible, because as in the document I mentioned, at the end of the document, what I have realized is that if the controller is running inside one of the deployed cluster in KIND, it's actually running as a container inside a container. And then how do you call outside the KIND, which is in the outside world? So right. That's a pretty interesting issue. So probably the starting deployment, what I don't like, but the first step will be to run the controller as a process in my own machine. but using kind just to provide the cluster and to be able that I can actually test all the life cycle, because this process will be reading from the API server.
Right, but so it can create clusters today. It sounds
Yeah.
like we're looking.
No,
at
yeah, that the Kubernetes cluster
machine
is
use case is a little bit less clear.
yeah. The part of the Kubernetes cluster is covered. Actually, I mentioned that in the document, which is basically covered. However, as you said, the machine controller needs to create individual nodes and append them to the, it's repeating the provisioning logic. I mentioned the other day that there was like in a hacky way trying to find out if this is possible. And I was looking around the code, and the code basically is reusable, I would say, to 95% possible, because it's already well structured in steps and whatever. So it's like having like provision node command or way to call it. The only trick there is that actually I will need some additional information that once you create a cluster, it's there somewhere, but it's not readily available, because it's like this building memory, that you create all this in memory representation of the cluster, and then you have all this process of creating all the nodes. But once the cluster is done, I will have to like recreate this information. So, but in my use case, that is not really that important, because the controller will actually have that information itself. It's part of its own duty. So I think I can basically provide all the information.
Yeah, I get the thing that I'm not getting is to me, from the way that kind works, I don't think they really match as machines. Like, for example, something that we haven't really targeted as a use case right now is people being able to run commands on the nodes themselves. We've kind of backed away from that because, unlike the cluster API, we're not actually giving you a VM. Whatever is going on in that image is just what we need to like make it possible to boot Kubernetes inside of Docker. And it is an unusual environment, and we may have to change it over time. So, if something else is taking over all the steps that run inside of the machine, it's going to need to know about the fact that that machine is not a normal machine and it can't do things the way that it would.
Actually, from the perspective of this particular use case, that is not an issue, because what actually the machine provider provides is something that is able to connect to the. It's basically what we do. Is that is abstracting actually all that. So when I say the provider, is something that make curated nodes appear somehow. The rest of the components don't really care how this happens. That's why it makes this architecture interesting, is because you actually can do that. If I should have to know something about the particular implementation, then it means that somehow the architecture is broken, because I cannot decouple the genetic management for knowing how do you bring this particular node to life. So I think that is not, in the particular use case, it's not really an issue, because I don't need to know that. The only thing I need is that somehow a node appears in that cluster, a new node. I need to see that
when
happen.
You say that, do you mean fully configured or just as a machine? Because it sounded like from your use case, you didn't want to be configuring the node with, like, say, Kubernetes, and that there are some details that we have to plumb through. Like, for example, in the past, we've had to work around DNS not booting properly during setup because of the Docker and Docker environment funkiness with the networking. And, like, I wouldn't expect a usual cluster API implementation to be doing something like that.
So, sorry, I didn't get that. What the issue is?
So like, is Kind still is Kind still running Kubernetes and setting up all the manifests, or is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. It's fine. Eventually, and that's the other use case that is more from my colleague Alvaro, who is the other person that you was also interacting with. He has kind of the opposite use case. He's like, he doesn't really care much about all what I'm talking about. He wants to control or test the initialization process, because we are also testing some. I understand, and there is what you said that it's trickier, because
Right. So in
Again,
this case, we are actually fully provisioning the Kubernetes node.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I think that one makes a lot more clear sense right now. I think right now, I'm probably need some more details of what this information is supposed to look like, and I do want to point out that we are trying to get like all of the existing use cases fleshed out that were kind of in the original design, and we have quite a bit in our backlog still before we can get those things done. So actually, the next topic I wanted to discuss today is getting another minor release out with some alpha fixes, and we have some more things that I think we should really sort out for that one as well. But I like this idea a lot. I think it's not completely obvious to me how much this helps the cluster API, but it could be really interesting to see a like local implementation of this.
Actually, I wrote this topic that one political issue that they have is that they're talking about making some presentation on the QCon, and the question was like, which provider we use, and say, well, let's make every presentation we use a different one, because one with Amazon, one with, because and I mentioned like, hey, why don't you use a local like kind? And people say like, man, that makes no sense. But like, I think that later they like started thinking like that. We need something like that, because eventually for demoing, it's a lot easier. I mean, and training and whatever and development, because it's something you can test easily without any sophisticated external setup that can basically, because you don't want to really test that. You want to show your own stuff, which is the controller. So hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, could you add some more details about what you're looking for from Kind on that, and follow up with an issue?
Sure.
A new one. I think we're going to need to, we kind of intermixed a bunch of discussions on the previous issues. I think we're going to need to close those out in favor of some new, more focused issues.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Can I jump in for a second? So if I pull way back out, this sounds a little bit like, and correct me if I'm wrong, right now the state of Kind today is it creates clusters, it deletes clusters. It doesn't actually do anything to manage a cluster in place, right?
Right.
And so I could potentially look at this as trying to extend Kind to update the cluster in place, which seems like we haven't quite wrapped up the create and delete stuff. So then, separate and apart from that, this reminds me of a fun time I had with a provisioner that used Terraform to stand up a cluster. And so Terraform described how many nodes were in the cluster, and it stood it up, and then the cluster's like cloud provider automatically provisioned nodes, and those nodes didn't show up in the same state that Terraform was maintaining about what Terraform thought the cluster was supposed to look like. And it was not a happy situation. And I have concerns that we'll need to be prudent about if we're somehow magically dynamically adding new nodes, that it's done in a way that like Kind agrees with. If we're saying that Kind is the source of truth for this cluster, all of this is a more detailed way of saying this sounds great, but it sounds like a really hairy problem, and I'm not sure we've appropriately wrapped up or polished the existing create and delete stuff.
Yeah, that's a good point. However, there is not such a, I mean, as far as I know, there's not a state. I mean, the state is the cluster itself. Actually, when you delete, what you do is basically go and retrieve all the node based on labels. So as far as if you want to know, you respect that labeling of the cluster. I think that for the delete part should be safe. Because there is no other state elsewhere, as far as I know.
Right. We only depend on the container runtime as a state source, so that will make some of this a bit nicer. I see Tim has his hand up patiently.
Yeah. So in a post V1 Alpha 1 world, like I'm trying really hard in the cluster API world to punt everything to post V1 Alpha 1. In fact, my whole goal in every single meeting is just for me to sit there and say, this sounds like a post V1 Alpha 1 thing. And this also sounds like a core piece of technology we would like in the core of Cluster API to be able to spin up, actually test Cluster API itself because it's more of a framework than it is an API, to have a default kind provider. And when we do that, there will be a lot more people actually working on that piece. That's months away, which will give folks enough time to get create and delete sort of in a state where they feel happy with. But I do totally empathize and agree that there are pieces of update that are non-trivial and may require what could be very large changes at this time. But I think we could do things like Fabrizio has broken down some of those upgrade pieces in particular into a set of potential actions. And we could just do minimal modifications and try not to upset the ship or create and delete so they can get their work done. And then once we get past V1 Alpha 1, we can sync again to try and look at the broader update/upgrade story, because that story from a provider standpoint, not just from a provider, from a cloud provider integration or cluster API provider, but from anybody who's using Kind, this ability to test skew across control planes is actually a super useful thing that we would really like.
Yeah, and skew across control planes is something that we should be able to, but haven't tried out today. But things like upgrade and actually changing the cluster state are very untread so far. And I would agree, I'd appreciate coming back to some of those things after we've kind of polished up some of them more. But it would be really good to start exploring how we might get there. I don't think we want to make those architectural changes yet.
I do think there are probably small modifications that are beneficial to Kind in general that actually help get us solve some of the core problems. I know Fabrizio showed up with like a thunk of code, but we could probably break it apart, pieces of this, to address, one piece that you need today that would be beneficial anyways, and then reevaluate at a later date.
On a similar note, sorry, go ahead.
You just mentioned that something that we are probably need to consider here. I mentioned that on the Slack. I think that probably some of these cases make more sense if Kind is used as a library and delegates like maintaining the state of the metadata of the cluster to somebody else. Because I mean, as the CLI is implemented right now, made a lot of sense because it's one action, one atomic action. You create the cluster, you delete it. And probably tweaking this tool to fit these other use cases where you probably need to maintain or keep track of the state of the cluster is too complicated. So I'm absolutely thinking that probably in my particular use case, I would be more interested in having a library that can be called from the controller, because the controller already has all the information, and it is the actual sort of truth about the cluster. It's only using Kind as a library for provisioning the nodes. I just mentioned that because I agree with Ben. He said that probably we were getting entirely outside the scope of Kind as a tool, but the internal pieces can be reusable as a library. So I'm particularly more interested probably moving to the library because I think it's easier to get there, because it's basically reorganizing the code in a way it's reusable without having to re-architect this whole process.
So that's happening some today in some tools like cluster API testing for the Bootstrap cluster, but it's in a similar note where there's still some coupling that hasn't been fixed between Kind as a command line and Kind as a library.
Okay.
And so one of the things I want to call is in that doc, it talks about the action stuff that's internal. And I think that is a really cool abstraction, and I'm happy we have it, but it needs a bunch of architectural changes. So I'd rather, if we think that, like, say the cluster API needs this like sequence of actions to do stuff, I think we should prototype something outside of Kind and use it, and at some point we can reconcile them, but I don't want to try to ship that outside of Kind as a public interface right now. I very intentionally moved that to internal to Create, because the one-shot action, like you said, of Create is a fairly thought out thing today. It needs a little bit of cleanup, but the guts of what's happening are definitely going to need rework, and they're very coupled to that like action thing. For example, right now, the action thing makes no accounting for any kind of concurrency between tasks right now.
What might be beneficial, which we've done outside of KK for our tools, is we create a two-phase set of libraries where we have a client tooling interface library. So if a person's going to import our code, they import the client library. And the client library has just basic, these are the supported functions, but then there's a separate experimental, right? And not actually do, Kubernetes versioning is a wonderkind, right? But anything underneath experimental gives you break capabilities, right? So that way, if you're looking at it from a client tooling perspective, like that is actually super useful. Then you don't care. You can thunk something into experimental, see if it works. I don't care right now. Just keep on moving. And just, your ability to break is totally up to the author's discretion.
I like that idea a lot. I just do also want to be clear that like some of the things that we're talking about moving into a place like that, I am 100% about to break. It just hasn't happened yet because they're not the highest priority, but like they need to be broken, and actions is a big one. And they're probably going to be broken pretty significantly. So I would just as soon say you might not want to build on that at all. You might build on something similar and we can reconcile it later, and then you won't be immediately broken whenever I get to this later this week or next week or something.
Well, also too, it shouldn't just be on you. If you need help, the whole purpose of this whole group here is to say, like, if you specify what you want done, to federate that out in a way so that way you can release the horde on your problem.
Yeah. So on that note and exposing things, I think there are a couple of things that we really should land early on that are important to a lot of the use cases of the create and delete. A really big one, I think, is being able to mount host paths. I'm interested if anybody has any good ideas there. I've looked at, we can do something like just allow people to provide extra Docker flags, but then we're locked into the Docker command line being underneath. We can attempt to shim it. The simplest thing might just be allowing host paths, but I appreciate some other people thinking on this. I might knock out an MVP today. It's been a really big ask, but it's because Docker does these really structured inline values for volume and mount flags, it's going to be really tricky to allow people to configure all of this without being just like bound to whatever format Docker has for those flags. And at some point, I imagine we might want to move to like the client library instead of shelling out to Docker. That is a really big task right now that can use some help. I also, if anyone's familiar with Hugo and Netlify, we do have those now, and it would be really good to get our docs restructured for that. The trick is we actually need to get the tooling set up to build one. We get a lot of questions now about like how things work and how I do things, and we kind of have some docs. It'd be really good to get that fully structured. So I guess those are my two big asks right now.
I wanted to ask about Hugo specifically. Isn't Hugo like an overkill for kind?
So maybe Hugo specifically, but some sort of tool like that would be good to do just so that we have like.
What was David Watt's tool that he used for cluster API? It's a lot cleaner and simpler. It's not Hugo. Sounds like.
So there's some other ones like Gitbook and things. I don't think those are a huge problem though. The main upside to using Hugo is that we have alignment with the other documentation projects, namely the main website, but also some CNCF work. Alternative tools definitely be looked into as well, though. I know Cube Builder is using Gitbook. There are some other ones, but I don't think that's necessarily the big problem. Is just actually getting around to setting one of them up. The biggest thing with most of these is finding a theme that kind of fits and getting that set up in the repo.
I guess my other question here is why do we have to set up the docs in the kind repo? Why can't we use the official website for kind documentation?
So we maybe could. On the other hand, we'll have to iterate through her processes, and it's not clear that it that like all of it belongs on there. Like maybe some, but I'm also I have somewhat of an ulterior motive in that I'm using this as a pilot for some other sub projects. In particular, some of the test infra tooling like Prow, I really don't think should be on the main Kubernetes website. But on the other hand, it's complicated enough that tossing some markdown around in a repo is not really making effective docs.
I'm adamantly opposed to the notion of federating out the documentation into the mainline repository, as this is such a nascent tool, likely and subject to change at some high velocity in the near term. That would just become a maintenance burden versus having the documentation directly applicable and then linking out from the main docs as a potential tool.
Right. The other reason is we're not asking the like docs subgroup to own this, and I don't want to ask them to own this, but I would like to see some of these projects have better docs than they've been doing and not just be like, oh, we have a README. There's a lot that you can do with this, and we're looking to make it possible to do even more. I'd even like to have like a subsection for like a developer guide. That's something that we've started working on a bit, but again, it's just another thing, and it can be hard for people to navigate when it's just poking around in a repo trying to find stuff.
Sounds good.
I also don't think it'll be significantly challenging. Once you have this set up and you have Netlify, it's very easy to iterate on and review. It will post a preview link of what it's going to look like on every pull request, and you can click through and see if everything looks fine without even having to actually like read the source code.
Yeah, it only posts a link to the whole website and there's no technology to post a link to the exact page that changed in the PR.
Well, I assume that's easy enough to figure out from looking at which files changed.
Yeah, possibly we can list them in a message at least.
Looks like we had some more topics possibly. So I guess those are the big ones that I have for the next one. I'd like to cut another small release maybe end of this week. I'd also looking at we should really automate pushing images. We should be able to tell people Kubernetes has a release, and within a very short time window, you should be able to spin up a kind cluster with it. Figuring out how that works logistically may be interesting. We have a repository we can push to, and I can get credentials set up for that. But like where we actually run this and how we make sure it's triggered and that sort of thing needs some thought.
So we don't have a bucket for the node images, right?
We have a Docker Hub as an intermediate thing until the Kate's Infra work group has decided how they want to do artifacts. I know there was a kept the WinInf for this, but I don't think there's further movement on it just yet. It's also, I think, a little bit more on that they're going to try to get the main images first, I think, and then we'll have to figure out some projects.
We're focused on just the main images right now, especially in the context of an image promoter tool. We'd be interested in playing looser and faster if it would help other projects, if A, people showed up to help out, and B, the very, very first thing we locked down was really, really visible billing. Because we're now spending money, it's really important that we know what we're spending our money on. And there is a reticence or hesitance to like just open up the floodgates if we don't actually know where all the money is going to be spent. That's the biggest blocking factor there.
But to be clear, the blocking factor is not right now, it's not having a place to push. It's figuring out all the logistics of making sure that we actually run the push at the appropriate time and for all the releases. And that can get tricky because we maybe need to do all of the different Kubernetes tags or backfill this or something.
So I know, at least for Prowl, like we build images on every commit and we push them.
Yeah, so the biggest trick there is that could work, but we'd want the way Prow gets away with this today for itself is I believe it's using a trusted cluster where it can have those credentials. And I believe that cluster is actually just the main Prow cluster. And that kind of makes sense for Prow itself, because if any of that is compromised, the whole thing is. But for like, say, Kind, we probably shouldn't be giving Kind jobs access to that cluster. But similarly, we don't want to be putting credentials to push images in the main one.
Okay, yeah, okay, never mind. I got it, I understand.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to have a like semi-trusted cluster that all it had was credentials to go push to someplace else. But now I am designing on the fly a thing that needs to be proposed and worked through with the work group.
Right, and independent of that, there's also just like, okay, how do we actually schedule it? Are we going to trigger on every time a push happens to Kubernetes and then try to figure out if it's a tag? What happens when we miss one of those pushes, because we do miss GitHub events? Do we want to schedule it regularly, and then do we have some kind of logic to like compute which tags need pushing? That's an open problem.
So Travis, with Travis, you can have secrets, I mean, it's kind of separate here. I'm just comparing to Travis. You can have a secret in the Travis config, and you monitor every commit. If the commit has a tag, you can create a release.
Right. So we can do that. What I'm saying is that there's a chance that it misses the monitoring the commit, and the other problem is this needs to run against the Kubernetes repo, for which we can't just like say add Travis or something. Assuming somehow Travis were actually better at it. The secret management is probably not the most interesting problem. We do have some options for that. It's the making sure that we're actually keeping up with all the tags and that we've backfilled.
Well, if it misses a tag, I mean, it can check the next commit, but yeah.
Yeah, no. I'm thinking probably at this point the best solution is to have some kind of hybrid model where we trigger on the tag, so we make sure that we push quickly after a tag is pushed, but we also probably need something to verify that we didn't miss one, because it's going to happen.
So
we webhooks from GitHub all the time.
Yeah, so how often can it happen? Maybe we can just manually fix this later, like manually build the images if this happens?
Yeah, we could start that way. It's hard to gauge how often it happens because that changes. Like the past week, it looked like GitHub was having significantly more issues with this. I know the OpenShift cluster in particular was seeing a lot of missed events.
Well, the alternative is for a job to run periodically and check, I mean, to not miss any hook, to check for attack. Yeah,
but then we're going to need some logic to figure out which tags, and so that somewhere in there we have to pick one of these, and then we have to tackle that actual that bit, because no one's done this yet. We have the official release process, and that is totally manually triggered.
Do you think that they're going to be tags different than the release tags?
So there are also like alpha and beta tags and things, but I think we want to be building for all of those anyhow.
Yeah, so basically any tag is a push.
Yeah, and at this point we don't need to worry about like old tags, because 110 back is not being pushed and Kind should work for 111 forward.
Yes. I mean, I could help if I knew how Prow is doing this. That's my problem.
So basically, we can write a job that matches on branch pushes, but you can do refs tags. I can do that. Again, that's probably the tricky part so much as the other logic for like, making sure that we check out to that tag and that we like run the appropriate builds for Kind and push and maybe auth to Docker Hub, and those sort of things need scripting out.
I mean, also this Do you think this is a priority for 1.0, or we can like basically work on this in time?
I think at least a like minimum working version of this is a priority for 1.0. I think it's important both to from like the release perspective of we want people to be actually able to. Aaron asked today at the release team meeting, has anyone actually run one of our alphas? And I think I was the only one that raised my hand, and that's because I'm used to building kind locally all the time. But I think maybe if we're auto pushing images, it'll be easier to say, hey, just run this, just set this flag to this tag, and you'll now have an alpha build. But we're not going to keep up with that well unless it's automated. It's also, I think, important for the use case of the people that are testing workloads, like maybe the cluster API on top. You shouldn't have to like check out and build, but you should be able to test more than just whatever we happen to be shipping as default at the moment. And similarly, sorry, go ahead.
I'm interested in how we could at least have this happen on the release boundaries. So like when we actually cut alpha builds and drop tags, if those could be converted into images. Part of me is saying like, what if this was the part of the branch manager's playbook? But the other part of me is like, no, this is a sub project trying to create a derivative artifact, and I shouldn't put that on the KK release team.
That's where I've been trying to tackle that. I think someone mentioned like, oh, what if we just put this in Ago? And it's like, well, should we also put like a Minikube release and like everything else, or?
God no.
Leave him space.
Yeah, that's where I'm like, I think, we're a derivative sub project. We should sort this out independent of the official release.
Does it lead to some kind of Cambrian explosion if we say that there's a path of like using a label preset? So right now, Prow uses secrets for credentials to talk to clouds. What if we had secrets for credentials to push to a Docker Hub account and then configured a Prow job to use that?
We can do that. I have some concerns about using that in the main build cluster because of things like kind, where we very much break a lot of the isolation in order to run things like Docker and Docker. It's not a super duper realistic concern, but it still feels iffy, and it feels more iffy for kind because we in turn turn around and run that as a privileged container. I'd like to keep that process pretty locked down. So today you're only trusting like me and James to not push some evil kind image / kind change. But if we have the build in the main Prow cluster, you're also trusting that like no job in the Prow cluster like tries to snag our credentials.
This is fair. See,
which is still, I think, a fairly big task, but like a lot more doable than if it were somewhere else. And we don't trust it for Prow itself today. Prow does not store those credentials in the main build cluster.
Correct.
I mean, similarly, we also use this to test Kubernetes CVE fixes. So like we know there are flaws and we know we don't have the fixes yet.
I guess we'd want this to be a CNCF owned space, or would we like, is that kind of a requirement for it, or?
So that's the other thing I'm wondering, and I should probably follow up with Aaron. A potential alternative is that just in the short term, I can just go through the hoops of getting a Prow build cluster up and just set it up myself here at Google. And with the intention that once the Kate's Infra work group is sorted out, we will move that workload. But there is a similar problem of like, clusters are fairly cheap, but do we want to have, like, how many of these things are we going to run? Is every project that wants to push going to get their own super duper cluster? Or are we just going to have like one that's like, okay, we trust the things that are only run with merged code, or what?
I suppose maybe with some of the checks that's already in the test infra repo used for Kubernetes security, we could do something similar and actually have a kind of semi-trusted cluster where we just run verifications on there to make sure?
Yeah, it's all different levels. I mean, similarly, we could just put the secret in the main cluster and we could put some kind of check that no one's mounting that credential, but then that check is less trivial, and I think I'm not sure I trust that level of isolation. Kubernetes is not the best at multi-tenant yet. And we intentionally violate some of those guarantees when we try to run kind of on top of it.
Yeah, from speaking as a representative of the infra working group, like I totally want to be helpful and supportive of projects and sub-projects alike. It's just more about, sure, each of these approaches sounds doable as a one-off. Now do it for 100 sub-projects.
Yeah.
And does it scale appropriately? How much thought do we need to put into it up front versus growing into something that's a little more scalable and manageable? In the short term, like a human manually pushing a build every 2 weeks isn't great, but could maybe allow us to limp along.
Yeah, we could, I could even as yeah. Ultimately, it comes down to where it runs, I suppose. But yeah,
we can follow up on these things offline. But I think we should. I don't think we need to have this for, like, say, the next release. But I mean, and I'm also, to be clear, I'm not necessarily sure we should actually call this thing 1.0 on the timeline we have currently. But I'm trying to at least push towards it by then. And I think we really should be building Kubernetes images on a regular basis automatically, like this release cycle.
So you said a magic word for me, which is timeline. And I don't know if I'm blowing your scope or your agenda, but one of the things I had on there was like the road to 1.0.
Yes.
So I know you have a milestone. That's what I linked to in the agenda. What is maybe less clear to me is the due date is the end of this quarter. Okay, never mind. I'm blind. But just kind of like maybe a administrivia suggestion. The way this template was set up is if this is a meeting that has recurring topics, you go through the recurring topics. We didn't do any of that. We just jumped straight into open discussion this time, but it might be useful for this crew if we're trying to push towards a 1.0 release of kind to review what's been done for the 1.0 and what is like the next most important thing for 1.0. I've seen other projects like I've seen other sub-projects walk through a project board or walk through a backlog of milestones or whatever. I'm not suggesting you have to do that right now, but just throwing that out there.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good idea. And we have actually made pretty good progress towards this. Some of these things, it's also not super clear if they absolutely have to happen in 1.0. For example, we do have some resources from Packet now to also try to figure out ARM CI, which is going to be another interesting question that we haven't solved anywhere else yet. Maybe we don't have to have ARM sorted out necessarily by then. We have it kind of optimistically included. But a lot of these other things are not actually super involved, and most of the other issues we're tracking don't necessarily seem like things that are going to be in it. Like, for example, maybe machine provisioning is not exactly a 1.0 thing. That's a follow-on.
Yeah, and that's what made me think of it, was to like try and figure out, so what is the scope of 1.0? You know, where's that documented, so that as people who are super interested in this amazing sub-project show up and want to do cool, neat things with it, aren't given just a blanket no, but given a not yet because ... We need to churn through all of these things first. And it sounds like your feature could maybe line up a little more appropriately here. Oh boy, I see a really quick hand from Tim on that.
All right. So SIG cluster lifecycle has a well-defined process that we've even documented in multiple locations now about how we do this. So anybody who shows up to a repo says, "Oh, I'm in the next bucket. I've been prioritized. You know, I know when it's coming. I know when to expect things to happen." But this way, if you have a well-groomed backlog, it's very clear to any observer what's going on for what milestone, when, and why, and how.
Yeah, I think we're headed towards some of that, but maybe not fully. For example, I think we only have like a 2019 goals as a next backlog between this smaller release and the 1.0, and not everything has been marked with it yet.
So Tim, in terms of this being really well documented, do you have a link you could share with this group so we can see what you're talking about?
Yep, I'm gonna try and find the Minikube version of it and see if I like it. If not, then I will. We've talked about it in every single SIG cluster lifecycle subproject.
Basically, my ask is, I've heard you say you run a really tight ship, and it's like well known. But I personally haven't seen it documented, because if it works really well for you, this sounds awesome. I'd love to hand it over to like contributor experience and say, please take this and copy paste it for all sub projects. Because y'all desperately need to work on growing your contributors and telling them what work needs to be done and what work is most important and where to go to find it, et cetera, et cetera. But I just don't see it.
The Minikube folks have taken my shtick and written it all into words, right? And the question is, I want to review it and hand it off. Okay, so it should be in the Minikube repo, and I have to double check that right now. But they told me that they had documented it in detail, and so I'm going to take a look at it and double check and see if it needs modification.
Okay, but so just so I understand, this is a process you have used for kubeadm quarter after quarter after quarter after quarter. It's not really documented there, right?
True. Yes. It's not documented in kubeadm land, but we also do it in Cluster API. We do it in all the Cluster API providers. It's all the same.
Tim has made this as a presentation multiple times in different meetings. Like, here is how we do it. Maybe we can also use a video link. It's much better as a video, I guess, as well.
Yeah,
if you have one, I'd love to go through that. We also have a bit of a roadmap document, but it probably needs some more updating as well. And that does cover a bit of what's in and out, but I think it might be worth tamping that to being a specifically one thing. I don't think it calls out that. It's more of a like long-term one, and then the milestone in the GitHub project are actually tracking which things are definitely landing in which release.
I wanted to ask, can you include the agenda document in the calendar invite, or
yes.
It's not possible to, if you join the meeting late, it's not possible to see the document.
Yes, apologies for that. I know also until sometime this weekend, the invite was also not properly shared out. I'm still getting that fixed. Let me put the doc link in there now.
Yeah, anyway, just to close that other loop, like I have totally heard over and over, like, look, we do it this way and it works. Just do it this way. I'm asking for like, show us the way, so we can work on that.
How about next week we just do a little bit of grooming?
Sounds great. I've also just fixed that doc link.
I actually want the process so I can hand it over to Kinfo and we can like advocate it. Because I think I heard a little bit of, okay, that's fine. I feel like I heard a little bit of like, we just do it, it works, but you're right. If I go to contributing.md, it doesn't say how we actually do all this stuff.
Yeah, I just took a quick poke through the Minikube docs. They have a lot of docs for contributing, but I didn't see anything covering this specifically.
Let me talk with Thomas, because he said he wrote it all down, because they went through a whole cycle too.
I guess we can quickly talk about the roadmap if you want.
Sure.
So I'm a big fan of realistic roadmaps for releases, and I mean we can kick stuff out of the. First of all, it's a question: is this the roadmap for the 1.0 release?
Yeah, I mean, so it's primarily one for that. because we hadn't thought too much beyond that when I was discussing this with James. But it was originally meant to be a sort of a 2019 roadmap, but it's really much closer to a 1.0 roadmap.
Yes, yeah, the CNI is probably pretty important for 1.0, I guess, the offline support.
Yeah, I think that's also going to significantly improve boot times, though. I do think we need to document this as well. The first time someone boots Kind, they're going to be like, wow, this image is huge. Kind must be super bloated. And it's going to be like, well, actually, we're just pulling down all of Kubernetes up front, and it turns out that's huge.
Yeah, they still need a CNI plugin to be downloaded from the internet. Yes.
Yeah, I would like to fix that like this week. That I think is one of the main reasons that boot is slower than it should be right now, because every boot is pulling that down.
So Windows support, you just need to push the release binaries in the GitHub release.
Yeah, so actually, I just mostly need to update the roadmap there. That one's actually pretty done, except maybe instructions for kubeconfig. That can get a little weird because I think it's a little bit more common to use shells on Windows that have different syntax for this. On Linux, we can pretty reasonably expect that you can just say export kubeconfig, and that's it. But on Windows, we don't know if you're using PowerShell or command prompt or bash or...
Yeah, and also the command prompt, the default one is pretty weird when you have to, like, it's not so flexible. I was wondering, should we even do this? Maybe the Windows users already know how, if they look at the Linux tutorial, they can basically port to Windows in a way.
That's something I'm wondering too. And that kind of ties in similarly to, I know there's a PR that we still haven't merged yet because not format for supporting Podman. And kind of similarly, that one goes through and it tries to make everything generic to containers, even though the interface is pretty much just mimicking Docker. I think it might be useful to keep some of these focused on the most common one with the additional ones are, but perhaps in the docs at least somewhere we can outline how Windows works, or we can remove some of this from the command line. I mean, right now, if you're on Linux, you can actually cut and paste the output from the end of kind create cluster and just use that, and it should behave properly. On Windows, that's not necessarily true, and it would be good to fix that or leave a note or remove it entirely or something.
Well, I'm going to take this. I'm going to make a proposal later for this. But yeah, it's kind of tricky because I might decide to use. I also have a bash shell on Windows, so I mean.
Right. So I don't know. We could even potentially someday do like shell detection or something. But I think maybe to start, we could just make the instructions more generic instead of giving the Windows users a cut and paste that may not actually work.
Okay, I'm going to work on this. Documentation, expand examples. So what other examples do we want to add?
So like actual common usages, doing things with it. Right now we have some info about like how you can boot it and like maybe how you might configure one particular thing, but we don't even, for example, show you how to do like an HA cluster right now, even though that's possible. Not that you need one, but it is a thing you can do with kind that there are actually 0 docs for currently.
So we need to document HA as well, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's some more things like that. Also maybe showing you, for example, maybe not in our docs, but at least linking out to like, here's how you would use this with kubetest to like iterate on Kubernetes locally and run some tests. We have an open issue for that one as well.
Yeah, I wanted to write documentation for kubetest only after we have some kubeadm jobs, like, I told you.
Right, and I agree with that, but by 1.0, we should get both of those things.
Yes, and I guess this is a question: should we add this documentation to the community repo about kubetest, or like where is the location?
I think probably a mix of both. That place where it currently tells you about how you can use hack local up cluster, it would be really nice to mention that you can do it with this as an option instead. I know that's something that Timothy wanted as well. But we might want to include at least some amount of docs in ours as well. And I don't expect these to change that much unless we significantly change kubetest at some point, in which case we'll need to update it everywhere anyhow.
Yeah, I guess my point was to get the kubetest deployer for kind stable and test it like with actual jobs, and only then start with the work.
Yeah, but I think we're at the point where we can start doing that, so we should be able to get to that fairly soon.
Yeah, basically this week I'm going to start. I guess I can start with docs parallel and adding the actual jobs in parallel to that. Okay.
That'd be great. And so the other thing we have under here is the GitHub Pages landing page. It looks like instead that's going to be Netlify, but basically the same thing. We're most of the way to that. We just need to actually make the pages. I mean, we even have content we can put in it in pretty good format now, thanks to George's work. We just we need to pick like Hue or something and actually set that up. I don't expect that's a huge task. The logging and debuggability stuff, though, we never wound up settling on a logging library just because Klog wasn't in a good, or Klog wasn't in a good place yet. I don't know if it's now in a good place. James might actually, or you might actually know about that.
So we're already using Logos. Can we basically pipe the output, the stream basically to a file somewhere instead of like switching to Klog completely?
That's what I was thinking about. We could actually solve a number of problems if we just said, okay, if you want to do like debugging output, it goes to a stream, and anything that should be user facing doesn't go through logging.
Yeah, and prints directly to a standard stream instead.
Right. But today we haven't actually fully done that. Some things do still go through logging. We're not writing to a stream. And for people consuming as a library in particular, you're stuck with we're logging to Logos's default instance, and you don't have good options for controlling that. So I mean, even if we're going to stick with Logos, we should make it easier to shim that out if you're going to consume it as a library.
Yeah, you guys need to look at my PR that basically does that exactly. It separates the backend no longer knows what logger is being used.
James, do you know if Klog is in a better place for this yet?
I thought I saw something go by the other day about adding support for an alternate backend. I'm just digging it up.
Okay, so if that lands, we should definitely look at that so that we can, kind of play nice within the ecosystem. But if that's not coming, then I think we should just go forward with a logger shim for now and own that.
So, yeah, they've got a package implementing the logger interface in terms of Kubernetes Klog. So,
okay, so I mean, maybe we should do the split it between logging and user facing and look at using Klogger then.
So I hate to do this to y'all, but you have 1 minute left.
Okay, so I guess the only other things are audit logging. That should just be documenting how to do that. And the non-AMD 64, I think we might need to punt that out of 1.0. And publishing kind images based on Kubernetes releases we already talked about.
Yeah, it makes sense to...
Everything else is out of scope in the roadmap.
Yes. Sounds good.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Aaron, for hosting this. And hopefully we'll get things better organized for next week.
Thanks all. Happy Monday.